Hi everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Low Season Traveller Insider Guides. I'm your host, Jed Brown, founder of Low Season Traveller, and this episode is taken from the 6th session of the Keeping the Dream Alive series of webinars, which we're collaborating on with the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage. In this episode, we hear from David Tarsh from Tarsh Consulting on the 10 key principles of communication and PR which tourism destinations and organisations should adhere to during a crisis such as COVID-19. Enjoy.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jed. So, yes, here are my top 10 tips for communicating in a crisis. The kind of crises I'm talking about would not just be the awful crisis that we're in at the moment, where demand has completely dried up because of the coronavirus. There are all kinds of different crises that could affect people in the hospitality and tourism industry. For example, we've talked about one or two with a pandemic. There's issues like terrorism. On the level of a hotel, you could have something going wrong, like, for example, undesirable people in the property meeting up with some of your valued guests. So the first point I would make to anybody looking to handle a crisis is that actions speak louder than words. And it's really important that anything that you say is backed up by what you do, and what you do is consistent with what you say. The point about a crisis is that that's often a moment when the media is giving you a level of scrutiny that you're not used to. And in those circumstances, you have to be very careful, because if you are inconsistent, they will pick that up and that will become the story. So you have to be very careful of that key fact. The next point I would make is that your chairman or your chief executive needs to take responsibility for the crisis. Now, let's say that you're an airline and you've suffered something ghastly like a crash, or the same might be true if you're a tour operator and you've had a bus crash. I'm not saying that you have to say it's our fault, not at all. The point is that when something awful like that happens, you have to be the front and center person speaking on behalf of the company or the organization, and you have to be responsible for the communication and the response from your company in terms of what it can do, and people will look to that. If, for example, the chairman or the chief executive is not present, the media will go to the chairman or chief executive almost regardless, because figureheads are important. The third point I'd make is, in that situation where you are the chair or the CEO, empathy is an extremely important quality. You need to empathize with all the different stakeholders who will all be suffering or affected in different ways. So, for example, your employees could be traumatized. If something's affected your customers, you're going to have a really important group which will be very possibly victims of a crisis, and they will suddenly become the most important people that you talk about. My fourth point is that you have to admit the setback. Quite often, I've seen clients and companies not want to say to the media that things are not going well. They're worried that if they say that things aren't going very well, it'll reflect in their bookings. People will say, oh, well, you don't want to travel with them then, or you don't want to go there. But if you don't admit the setback, you just look absolutely stupid. And you don't want to look stupid. You don't have to necessarily get involved in saying how bad the setback is, but you have to admit that there is a setback and it is creating challenges that you're dealing with at the time. My next point is that you must go to the scene. If you don't go to the scene, you can bet that the media will go to the scene, and they'll go there with television cameras. And if you're not at the scene, the first thing that they will ask is, where are you? And that doesn't put you on a good foot. to start with. So you need to turn up. In a crisis, because all of a sudden something's not going well, that is attractive to the media. They will want to talk about it a lot. And they will start to run all kinds of stories and rumors if they don't hear from you. So you need to communicate much more often. And we're seeing that at the moment, actually, with the leaders who are dealing with the COVID crisis. Certainly in the UK, for example, there's a daily press conference. You're specifically on that topic. You're seeing world leaders communicating much more often, giving regular press events, updating people on what's happening. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that fuels media interest, but it also helps you to control the message. My 7th point is that you need to be open about what you know and about what you don't know. For example, an air crash takes place. Always there's an air crash investigation, and it's not until the end of that investigation that you would be absolutely certain about what's going on. It doesn't usually profit you to speculate in advance, but it is important that you say, we are doing our very best to find out exactly what has happened. We're talking to the relevant people, and we will let you know when we know. But you don't have to know immediately. My 8th point is quite profound. I say, beware the lawyers. I say that because there are crises where, let's say, that I've seen where companies haven't expected there to be a crisis. Something happens totally unforeseen. And at that moment, all the senior people are panicking. They will often convene a board meeting, typically by phone, or they get together quickly. They have their key advisors on that call, and one of them is often a lawyer. Now, lawyers are usually, not all, but usually programmed to think about a situation where they might have to represent you in a court setting. And they will often want you not to say anything because they don't want to prejudice the case that they might have to argue in future. But in the case of a crisis, you are not in a court of law, you are in the court of public opinion. And in a court of public opinion, silence is as good as an admission of guilt. So if the lawyers are saying don't say anything, or they advise you to say no comment, that is almost certainly suicide. And I've seen occasionally companies or senior executives refuse to comment when they're in a crisis, and in a heartbeat, they trash their brand because customers and employees lose confidence. My next point is that actually, in a crisis, because bad things happen, there are also moments when extraordinarily good things happen. We've seen, for example, in the UK, an old gentleman, a guy called Captain Tom Moore, reaching his 100th birthday, decided that he'd walk laps of his garden in order to raise money for the National Health Service here. And it inspired people, so much so that he has raised £33 million by doing it. And he has become one of the inspirational characters of the crisis. Well, as a leader, you will find that if you're handling a crisis, there will be people in your organization doing extraordinary things that you wouldn't have expected. And it's a great moment to inspire your team and other people by highlighting their extraordinary acts. Those opportunities will come up. You might be wondering, why has David not mentioned that very famous Winston Churchill quotation, never waste a good crisis? It comes along with the idea of Fridays being a great moment to bury bad news. In a crisis, of course, people's attention is on the crisis and it's not on other things. So it's an opportunity to do things that are unpopular and not be noticed doing it. We're seeing that over here in the UK with certain local councils, now that there's no traffic on the road, implementing absolutely horrible traffic measures that will create dreadful gridlock. but they're getting away with it because everybody is focusing on the crisis. But be careful, because if you do something that's truly ghastly, you may get caught out. I think my final and most important point, it's point 11. It's the super point that trumps everything, and it should guide the way that you think about how you behave in a crisis, and that is, above all, be decent. If you are not decent, you will lose the public trust, you will lose the confidence of your own people. But if you really focus on being decent, what you will find is that people will look to you as a leader. So Jed, that's the top 10. Over to you for some questions.
Super. Come and join me up here on the top of the bar. If we can keep this slide on actually during the Q&A, I think that would be really helpful as well. So as we mentioned at the outset, we wanted to run this a little bit like a sort of a Q&A session, a bit of a surgery really for all of you out there to to help you to understand what you could and should be doing better in terms of PR. Thanks a million for that, David. I think one of the first things that we wanted to touch on really is gain an understanding of who's doing this stuff well and who isn't at the moment. Give us some sort of real life examples of who's doing this stuff really well.
Okay, so somebody who let's start with someone who's made a real people who made a real hash of it was Thomas Cook. I don't know if you remember. They had a situation where one of their holiday makers tragically died because a boiler malfunctioned in the rooms where they were staying. It belched out lots of carbon monoxide, and poor people died. It was really an unfortunate situation. And Thomas Cook tried to push all the blame onto the accommodation provider, saying it was their fault. And they got absolutely pilloried for doing that. They didn't take responsibility. Their lawyers advised them to push the blame onto the accommodation provider because they didn't want them to be liable. Thomas Cook didn't apologize for what had happened. They didn't have to say it's our fault, but they didn't apologize for this being a dreadful thing that happened on their holiday. They didn't own the situation and take control, and they ended up losing their chief executive and suffered horrendously. An example of somebody who's done things really well is Arne Sorensen, who's the current CEO of Marriott. And for anybody who's looking for an example of what is good practice, I would advise you to go onto the internet, go onto YouTube, and search for Arne Sorensen message to associates. Arne Sorensen message to associates on YouTube. And there he talks to Marriott employees around the world. And you will see that a number of these things that I've been talking about in terms of showing empathy, understanding the situation that the company is in, admitting that there aren't any guests at the moment showing up at Marriott properties, all of those things you will see in his talk to associates. It's about 5 or 6 minutes long, and it's really worth a watch.
And it's interesting that was obviously meant as an internal communication. That obviously, the ramifications of that externally reflect incredibly well, because is there an element where we do kind of judge organizations by how they treat their staff as well as by how they treat their customers?
Oh, you're right about that. It's how they treat anybody, quite honestly. Yeah. And when the media is watching, if they treat anybody badly, that's the story. I think there's here is one of the things that I've learned from doing PR. There is a famous saying, no news is good news. And many people will think that what it means is if you don't hear anything, it's good. No. What no news is good news means is that if something is good, it's not news. Effectively, the currency of media is all about what's going wrong and what isn't good. Now, journalists will tell you, no, we cover positive stories. But the balance between negative stories and positive stories is overwhelming. And that reflects human nature, and it reflects what one's appetite is for media. So if I were to tell you that an airline's flying, all the planes are full, you go, fine. But the minute that one of them's empty and they might be losing money, you're just much more interested. And that is why journalism has to focus on the bad, because audiences are interested in what's going wrong. To illustrate this point, a few years ago, a group of journalists from a very well-known newspaper group got sick of writing nothing but bad news. And they said, no, why is it we always have to write bad news? We want to write some good news for a change. And they persuaded the management to let them launch a new newspaper that would have positive news in it instead. And it was called the New Day. Well, shall I tell you how long that newspaper lasted? It was launched, and within less than a fortnight, it had been closed because nobody wanted to read it.
There's something incredibly sad about that, though, isn't there?
It is
fact that we are conditioned to look at the bad news all of the time. So is it then more, in terms of the opportunity for PR, is it about seeking out the bad news and how you can put a good or positive spin on that bad news and in some way be associated with that wave of news, but obviously in a positive way?
If you can pull that off, it's absolutely great. It depends on what your situation is. Depends on a whole range of things, really. But I would say that riding the news agenda is certainly a good way to be covered. If we take, for example, a company that you'll know very well, ForwardKeys. ForwardKeys has got the best available data there is on flight bookings. We represent ForwardKeys. Now, every time there's some kind of crisis that affects tourism, the media is hungry for data and information. They want to be able to describe the scale of that crisis and what's been happening. If a destination, let's say, has been badly affected, be it a hurricane, be it a terror event, be it a disease pandemic, whatever, quantifying the scale in terms of loss to tourism can be described quite well by people not traveling or people not booking. So in the case of ForwardKeys, we'll often produce numbers that will describe that, and the level of coverage that one gets is enormous.
And that's purely because they're being associated with, in many cases, the bad news. Whether it be, and just for all of the audience out there, I used to work at ForwardKeys, so I'm very familiar with the ForwardKeys data, and it was always intriguing because as soon as anything happens in the world, actually it does affect tourism. We've learned this, whether it be a war, whether it be a SARS or a pandemic, no matter what happens in the world, tourism is affected by it. And like you say, David, the first thing everyone wants to know is, how badly is it affected? And that's, of course, where ForwardKeys were able to sort of get on there because they had the data that goes with it. Is there any PR opportunities to be had from good news?
Well, occasionally. If you've done something truly wonderful and excessively brilliant, it's possible to be picked up. I mean, if you manage to win a Nobel Prize, for example, you'll get in the news. If your team's won a major international competition, you'll be in the news. But generally, good news, if it is in the news, will probably play only in your trade media, if you're a company. And it won't play for very long or with great prominence for the reasons we've discussed. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to PR when you've done well. You should make announcements when you've done well. And if you get covered, that is excellent. But the really important thing is when you do get a piece of positive news coverage, and it doesn't come that often, but it does come, when you've got a major achievement. For a company, for example, it might be if you've won a very big order. If you've won a very big order, that's a properly good achievement. And you might find that the business press would be willing to report it. Not necessarily that prominently, but report it they still may do. The extremely important thing I would say is get those coverage clippings and circulate them to your clients and to your prospective clients. The value is not just in the fact that you've appeared somewhere positively. The real value is that you take that positive endorsement that you've got from a credible third party and you spread it as hard and fast as you can throughout your network. And that is a really important thing that many people don't think to do.
Yeah. We're getting some questions coming through just now. This is quite an interesting one. Truth and honesty is always the best policy. How do you counter media who choose to twist your words for their own purposes?
Oh, you brought back to me a moment. Actually, a great moment that caused me enormous entertainment in the past, where I spoke in an Oxford Union-style debate in front of an enormous audience of communications directors. And the motion for that debate was honesty is always the best policy in communications. I thought to myself, ooh, that's interesting. And at the start of the debate, I thought that's interesting because I could have some fun here. And at the start of the debate, there was a poll. Hands up, how many people thought that honesty was always the best policy in communications? And we had a room full of PR executives and marketing people. Overwhelmingly, they said that was the case. And then I had the great enjoyable moment of trying to prove that honesty was not always the best policy in communications. And actually, I had a fantastic time making fun of some famous advertising slogans. Like, for example, British Airways is the world's favorite airline. Who believed that? Or Heineken refreshes the parts that other beers cannot reach. Who believed that? And then there was a phenomenal example of a guy called Gerald Ratner, who had an enormous chain of jewelry stores. And he spoke at an event all about his product and how he'd managed to make quite so much money. And he said, well, the truth is really what we make is total crap. And that comment was picked up, went around the world. His share price dived. He lost his job. So honesty is not always exactly the best policy in communications. The important thing is that you have to be judicious about what you say and how you answer questions. That's really part of the art and part of the skill. Just a little bit more color on this. People will often comment about politicians and they'll say, oh, the trouble with a politician is that he hasn't answered the question. Now, actually, when you're doing a media interview, it's not all about answering the question quite so much as about addressing the question. And if you address the question well, then you come across okay. In fact, if we think about it, I did answer your question just now, but I started off more by addressing it, referencing another event where I'd actually discussed honesty as the best policy.
It's very similar, actually. I'm reminded of, I was given advice years ago when going for job interviews, as we've all done, and somebody said to me, basically create all of your answers at the beginning. And then whenever you have a question, you just work out how you're going to, which one of your answers you're going to fit in to what that question is. But all of the answers that you're creating are all obviously very much about your positives, about your great experience and everything else. And it's just a matter of making sure that whatever question comes your way, that you choose the right answer that you can frame within some way of addressing that question, but you would have all of your answers prepared to begin with, because one of my worries, and I guess a lot of people on this call, their worries when they're doing any kind of media interviews is, what if I'm asked a question that I can't answer? And I guess is that the same kind of advice? Is it you have all of your answers prepared and you make sure that you find one which fits?
What I would say to that one is another great saying: fail to prepare, prepare to fail. It's a great saying. And my advice on that one is rehearse.
Yeah.
Rehearse if you can, with somebody who's going to put you through the pressures of an interview, because actually that's going to help you answer questions that you're not expecting and be ready for that interview. And it's the rehearsal that's really the most important thing of all. There's often going to be a curved ball question, and the skill is knowing how to deflect it. And if you've rehearsed, then that will be possible. I could tell you a story about a situation that I had, which was all about rehearsal. A few years ago, the Tanzanian government decided that what they wanted to do was to put their stockpile of ivory beyond use, and very important for the whole debate about poaching and for the trade in ivory. And what happens is that if you're a place like Tanzania, elephants die and you collect their tusks, and actually it's all quite valuable, and you end up building up a big stockpile, and it's valuable. So you might think they want to sell it, but then of course that fuels the ivory trade, and then elephant poaching, and then people don't come to the country because there aren't enough elephants to see when you're on safari. So it's a huge issue. Anyway, they decided that they were going to put their ivory stocks beyond use, and they wanted to do it at a big international conference that was sponsored by the Prince of Wales in London. And they came over to London, and at the last minute they suddenly thought actually they should be trying to get some media coverage for this, and I was asked to help them out, which was a great pleasure. And we got the Minister of Tourism and Natural Resources into the media all over the place, loads of interviews. And at the very end of the round of media interviews, which they were extremely pleased with, they said to me, David, that was fantastic. In fact, there's only one thing that could have been more fantastic, and that would have been if you had got the minister onto the BBC Hard Talk program. Now, I don't know if any of your viewers are familiar with Hard Talk, but it is a half an hour one-on-one interview with a BBC journalist. Currently, the host of it is a gentleman called Stephen Saka. And you can be grilled about absolutely anything. And you have to be pretty brave to go on to Hard Talk because everything's on the agenda and you can't escape in a half an hour one-on-one interview. So I called up the series producer for Hard Talk, explained who I could offer as a guest, and asked if they were interested. And they said, well, we'd be delighted to have him on and talk about ivory and poaching and everything else. And they were thrilled to bits, but we couldn't do the Hard Talk program till the following week. So he stayed a few more days in London and rehearsed and booked a studio, and I rehearsed him. And we did 2 live run-throughs with me playing Stephen Saka, asking all the nastiest questions that I could in a TV studio, and we put TV cameras on it. Well, I have to tell you, if the first interview that I did with him had run on air, he would for certain have lost his job.
Really?
Minister, for certain would have lost his job. And the whole point is that I got his team to unlock every possible skeleton that was in his closet, and I went for them one after the other, after the other, after the other, for half an hour. And not surprisingly, in that time, he made a few slip-ups and said things he shouldn't have said. But when it came to the real interview, he didn't make slip-ups and he didn't say anything he shouldn't have said. And the consequence was that a lot of people said it was a brilliant interview.
Yeah.
Prepare to fail. The answer is to rehearse.
Love it. Got a great question here from Alistair Henchman. Do you manage a crisis caused by your business differently to one caused by external forces such as COVID-19?
I think that's a really good question. The answer is that you have to take more ownership if it's being caused by your business. You have to take more responsibility, and there is much less chance to deflect. I was acting for a very big wholesale tour operator at one point where there was a bus crash, actually. And the first anybody heard about this bus crash was that it was a group of Japanese tourists, and NHK, which is the BBC of Japan, one of their journalists rang me up and said, I'm calling you about your bus crash. I'm thinking, bus crash? What on earth has happened? And I had to spend quite a bit of time figuring out what had happened, because actually the bus crash was a bus that had been organized by my client, but it had been organized for my client's client, and the bus operator was a third-party bus operator. So actually, my client, the wholesale tour operator, was really just an organizer in the middle. But what happened was that NHK turned up in the foyer of their offices demanding an interview. So we had to act very swiftly, and the managing director, I arranged for the managing director to go down with a statement, talk to the media, to say immediately that we were aware, we sympathized with the situation, we were doing our absolute best to find out the details, and that was about as much as we knew at the time, but we fronted that up as quickly as we could. Subsequently, having discovered the details, we were able actually to pass all the media inquiries on to both the tour operator, who was the client, who we'd taken time to brief, and also to the bus company that ran the bus. And actually what happened was that my wholesale tour operator then had no more PR to worry about. So we successfully deflected attention elsewhere. Now, if they'd been running and operating that bus, we couldn't have done that. We would have had to front it up a lot more about the investigation that we would have been running, and what we had discovered. But yes is the answer. You can handle it differently, but you still have to own it in the moment, and you still have to show up in front of the media.
Yeah. Question here from Kevin Murphy. Good afternoon to you, Kevin. Oh, it's just flicked off. Hold on. Sorry. In the context of COVID-19, what different approaches are the best direction for hotel operators, hotel owners, NTOs, and associations?
Well, I think the best answer I can give you on COVID-19 goes back to I'm reminded two gurus of the industry on this one. One is Bill Marriott at the time of the SARS crisis. And I don't know if you remember, at the time of the SARS crisis, travel across Southeast Asia absolutely dried up. And it also coincided with worries about terrorism post 9/11. It coincided with a recession, and it also coincided with the Second Gulf War. It was a disastrous time for the industry. And I can remember what Bill Marriott said to the whole hotel industry and the policy that he was implementing. He said to everybody, close all the lower floors and upgrade all your guests and give them a better experience, because you can afford to do that. It's a sensible way to operate in these moments, and guests will thank you for being treated more nicely. That was his advice. Something even more profound I got from a gentleman called David Mongeau. David is a former hotelier. He then became an investment banker. He started his own investment bank, and within 18 months, it got to the number 2 in the deal rankings behind UBS. He was so good at deals and investment banking. He now invests in hotels, and he's got an asset management, hotel asset management business with, I think, about 3.5 billion of assets under management. And he was explaining to me about how to make money in the hotel industry. And the absolute key to making money in the hotel industry is that recessions, he said, look, recessions come along. You can't avoid the fact that there will be a downturn at some point. And the vital thing is when the downturn comes, you should close your hotel. Take that moment as the opportunity to refurbish it and upgrade it. It'll take you about as long as the recession to do all the necessary work. But when the upturn comes, you've got the nicest property in your category. And with the nicest property in your category, people will want to book it, they will want to stay there. And then you ride that upturn as hard as you can with the best property in your category until the next recession comes along. As sure as anything, it will. And then when you get to that next recession, you do exactly the same thing again. You close it, you upgrade, you refurbish, and when the upturn comes, you ride that next upturn. So what should the tourism industry do at this moment? I think the truth is we haven't got any clients, and it doesn't look like clients are coming. So going mad trying to win the few clients that are out there is probably a fool's errand. The smart thing to do now is to think about all the measures that you can take to look after your guests when they come. And we're seeing some of the big companies doing exactly that. They're reconfiguring the layout of their restaurants. They're rethinking how their destinations work, what they'll do for when the place reopens and you can have guests with social distancing. And they're thinking about taking initiatives to make the place better. I know, for example, that Radisson is currently working really hard on new signature dishes for their restaurants in Africa. I mean, that's a really smart thing to do. I would say this is a perfect moment if you've got outside space to think about building a retractable awning if you haven't got one. You know, outside space, when the weather's nice, you want to open it up, use it to sell food. Of course, if you want to build an awning over it, you need nice weather to do that. And you're always in the dilemma of, are we going to shut the outside space to build the retractable awning and then lose all those customers or not? But of course, once you've built it, then you can operate it even when the weather isn't nice. Well, this is the perfect moment to do something like that.
Yeah, it's a golden opportunity, isn't it, right now?
Well, it's also, I suppose, in fairness to the industry, Jed, I'd say it's a moment where you have to be brave because you're going to be doing it at a minute where you've got no guests, no revenue, and you're going to have to take on debt probably to finance it. So you're going to need to be brave. You're going to need to have backers who are going to say, I like that strategy. But I think one has to think that in tourism and hospitality, one's playing a longer game. You know, there's going to be next year, there's going to be the year after. And actually, this could well be a moment when you'll be able to find the contractors at a cheaper rate because companies are not quite so busy. And you'll certainly find finance at a great rate because interest rates have never been so low. And you might also be able to find that governments will underwrite or back those loans. So I would say this is the moment to be brave and to be investing. But it's tough to think.
It feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? But of course, you know, for all the reasons that you're giving, it's absolutely the right thing to do. But it does take guts, doesn't it?
It takes guts. But you know, this is why I quote the people who I do, who have made absolutely tens, if not hundreds, or in Bill Marriott's case, probably even more, millions of dollars in the hotel industry. And they figured these things out.
Yeah. Super. Great question coming up from Greg Girard. Gug, good to have you with us. If media is prone to be attracted to negative news, then is there a case study of marketing good news under the guise of bad news to generate media coverage with positive results? And that's from Gug in Canada.
Oh, I'm scratching my head.
I understand completely where he's coming from on that, because what you were sort of saying before is that bad news is the stuff that naturally gets picked up, and it gets picked up quite widely. The natural thing to think is is there anything we can kind of do as under that kind of a guise, but is actually going to reflect really positively on us, that could really get taken up.
Well, I think that there are times. I mean, Jed, you're right. You want to try, if you can, to present something positive in the moment where everything is negative. Absolutely. If you were the hotel, about to launch your new restaurant with your new signature dishes and your all of that, for the minute that things open, you might be able to get some media coverage, because the day that the industry is open, the opening up will be on the main news agenda. And if you can talk about something inspiring and different that you've got ready for that moment, you might be able to catch some journalist interest. So yes, you want to try to do that if you possibly can. But don't believe that you're going to get lots of coverage from it. But you might get the piece of coverage, the one good article that you're then able to use to merchandise yourself. So it's definitely the right thing to try to do. You just have to be aware that mega coverage on it is perhaps tougher.
Yep. Another question here from Tony Hallwood. Hi, David. Having been responsible for PR at 2 UK airports over 14 years, your top 10 tips are very accurate. Having faced the TV cameras on many occasions, your preparation points are critical to show confidence and that you're in control of your subject. However, your point about good news is underplaying the opportunity that travel businesses have to promote themselves, especially where they can deliver new products, economic value, and jobs. One comment that resonates with me is that many CEOs are unwilling to face the camera as they fear failure and embarrassment. David, keep up the great work. My question relating to embargoed news: how soon before general release would you give any exclusive interviews?
How soon before general release would I give exclusive? It would depend. A cracking question, and I'm so pleased we're on the same wavelength. And if you've handled crises for major UK airports, you've properly lived it. So in many cases, I would be deferring to your expertise, I have to say. I think with embargoed news, it's very much a question of what is the story that you've got. I think if you've got the bigger the story, there's pressure on a big story to break it, and there's pressure from the media to break the embargo. But if you've got a big story, you can probably hold it for longer, and you can probably get more journalists interested. If you haven't got such a strong story, you can't hold it for so long, because their interest will pass. I think that's my experience. The only thing is, I would say I'm never quite sure on any story that I'm handling as to how interested the media will be. There are moments when I've got a story, I think it's terribly good and interesting and ticks all the right boxes, and I find journalists aren't interested in it. And then there's occasionally a moment when actually something that I don't think should ever have the right to make the news gets their interest. And it happened recently, actually, to me. If somebody says, what's your absolute cliche of something that is not news? I would say it's when you as a company launch a new website. I mean, it's new, but it's highly promotional. It's all designed to promote your business. And I would say that's my cliche example of something that you're doing that probably journalists won't be interested in. Companies launch new websites every day. There's nothing groundbreaking in it. It's purely promotional. Anyway, I had a client who did launch a new website, and I said, well, fine, we can put a press release out, but don't expect much coverage. And lo and behold, 5 different trade media all covered it, and I was wrong. So it's right to live in hope.
Play. Love that. A couple of other questions coming through. I love this one, because this reminds me of many politicians actually spring to mind as well. If your CEO goes off script when faced with media interrogation, how do you bring it back on track?
Oh my God, that's a real challenge. I would hope you, if you're really canny, maybe you've rehearsed for this. And I think if you have rehearsed for this, I think the important thing is that if you're the comms guy and he's gone badly off script, I think what I would suggest is that you're standing in the back of the audience and your hand shoots up with some pre-prepared question, and hopefully he notices. And I say he because, okay, most CEOs are he's, but I would say it's the he's who are probably more likely to go off script than the she's.
Yeah, fair play. That was a great question. If the CEO or senior executive does something that demands, this one could be quite topical. If the CEO or a senior executive does something that demands his or her resignation, what are the key steps for building reassurance with your staff and customers?
If the CEO has to go, the chairman has to step in.
Right.
Simple as that.
And it's the chairman that has to give over then the positive messages.
With a plan. And with a plan about what you're going to do. Very important. There's no alternative.
Fair play. Question from Nigel Fell. Good morning to you, Nigel. Regarding destinations, are there any tourist boards who are getting their message right? If not, what should destinations be doing now to remain front of mind to encourage future arrivals? So yeah, tourist boards wise, are there any that you're seeing that are kind of getting the messaging just right at the moment during this COVID crisis?
I have to confess that I haven't seen a lot of promotion from tourist boards at the moment. I think there's an argument that you might want to be having a destination people dream about, but I think it's difficult for tourist boards because this is a moment where people are not thinking quite well. Some people are thinking about a holiday at some point into the future, but it's not an obvious moment where you're going to get a return on that marketing investment. So none spring to mind.
Okay.
And it might be that there are some, but I haven't spotted them.
It's interesting because one thing that we have seen quite a lot of from the tourism authorities are these videos that have been coming through in dribs and drabs over the past few weeks, which is it's not safe to travel now, but when the time's right, come to insert destination. And it's interesting because the first one or two, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I love that, bringing the destination to life. But then once you see a few of them, you're just thinking, okay, you're all now the same in one big hodgepodge. That differentiation, incredibly hard to do when nobody's traveling and we all have the same media available to us, I guess.
I mean, I think the principle that I've mentioned for hotels, I would apply to destinations, which is what can you do to upgrade that destination and have something exciting for when the market comes back? I mean, I think, for example, if you've got a destination that's great for diving, can you find a wreck to sink at this moment? That's the kind of thing I would be thinking about. What are they doing? What are the smart things they're doing to prepare the place so they've got lots of good stories when the upturn comes? And that kind of activity you probably wouldn't see in the media.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's the smart work.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's bring in Carolyn and Chris and see if you guys have got any questions for David as well. Are you there, Carolyn?
I am indeed there, Jed. I noticed there are quite a few almost kind of direct questions about specific organizations and entities. So one of those, I know there are a few #AvGeeks on the webinar. What should Boeing do with the whole MAX thing and the follow-up from the MAX crisis?
They have to fix the plane. They have to fix the plane. They have to have independent experts declare it airworthy, and they have to not market it until they have got independent experts giving it a full, clean bill of health. Anything they try to do beforehand is going to blow their credibility, and that's what they've been trying to do to some extent, and they're not looking credible. So they have to fix it. Simple as that. You can't sell a plane that isn't safe. Simple as that. They've got to make sure that it's airworthy. It's got to be certified, and when it is, they can start to market it again, but not until.
Cool. And similarly, a question around the subject of what should the WHO do at this point in terms of their communications?
Well, which bit are we talking about? Are we talking about Donald Trump saying they aren't doing a proper job?
No, I think this is more about the, I'm just going to script up to the question because we have had quite a lot of questions, David, and I've been scanning up and down them. What would your suggestion for the WHO at this time, given the way the world is looking at what they might not have done right, and the way there has been, quote, action stroke non-action on China and how that's been viewed?
I'm not sure how, and other people might know the answer to this more than I know the answer to this, but I think right at the heart of it is I'm not sure how well or badly China has behaved. And that's a really important question. It's an important question because if China would, of course, have you believe they've behaved incredibly well. I don't know how well they've behaved. If they can be proven to have not behaved well, then they need to be called out for behavior, and the WHO needs to say so. If, on the other hand, the Chinese have truly done everything that they should have done in a timely manner at the right time, then they shouldn't be called out for it. And I think the key thing for the WHO is it has to have real integrity about its own health advice with its own experts. And if it loses that integrity, that intellectual integrity, then it will lose all credibility. And that's what it has to remember. It's an international organization that is appointed, by people around the world to take a central role. And any organization that's appointed by others to take a central role has to recognize that their duty is owed to the whole community. And that means if one person is transgressing, you have to say so. And if one person's getting it right, you have to say so. But you have to have your experts evaluate with full intellectual integrity. And you cannot lose that intellectual integrity in either direction. That's what I would say if I were their advisor.
One from me, David. Sorry, just on we sort of touched on everybody's favourite person. Let's face facts, Donald Trump. We've got your 10 tips in front of us. I would say pretty much he's done the opposite of every single one of those. And this is a serious point, actually. And Carolyn, maybe you want to step in on this as well, because in marketing and in business, sometimes you can do the stuff that's recommended, and there is always success when you go completely the opposite way. You do exactly the opposite, and it's a point of differentiation, and frequently it works. Is that what Trump's trying to do? Is he just trying to do? Is he trying to do just the opposite of everything that should be done, and just bizarrely it seems to be working in many circles?
The answer, Jed, is look at his poll ratings.
Yeah, it's frightening. Yeah, it's just I just find it interesting how we have all of these rules in sales, in marketing, in PR and communications, and frequently there are people out there that find huge success by literally doing the exact opposite. I don't think it's a recommended course of action, though. Would you agree?
Oh, well, if I could add to that, Jed, I think this kind of nicely links David's topic to one of the things we talked about last week, which is knowing your customer. And I think you have to remember that if you look at who Trump is talking to, he's talking to two audiences in two different ways. And one is his base. And his base, absolutely, he is speaking to them and engaging with them. And the other audience he's speaking to is almost equivalent to human clickbait, which is the more people outside his base are outraged, the more it validates the belief sets of his base. So I think that's where the understanding of the customer psyche and the way that we process information and beliefs. We're very, very prone. There's been a lot of research done on what happens when Trump's base hears him do something that they don't like. They are now so attached to him as their spokesperson, they discard the beliefs. They do not discard him. So that, again, I think when you look at who he's talking to, he is absolutely talking to his customer base. I think, to be fair, I think he's been following number two, has he not? Which was, we've seen quite a lot of the chair or the CEO in that context, but I might kick it back to David at that point.
I think your analysis is very, very cute, Carolyn. I mean, there's the question that he talks to his own base and he's reliant on them to get him re-elected. And I think in looking to blame China and blame the WHO, he's pursuing a well-proven strategy of leaders, which is if you can pick a fight with somebody external, that normally helps your ratings in the polls. And one of the best examples I can think of that was I don't know if you'll remember the Falklands War, when Margaret Thatcher took the UK to war against Argentina over the Falkland Isles, which a group of Argentinians occupied, and the UK government sent a task force big naval task force to go and get the islands back. And she did tremendously well in the polls after that, by picking a fight with somebody external. And I think Donald Trump's certainly trying to do that.
It's a deflective strategy, isn't it?
I think there was a question that I want. Go on, David, please continue.
The situation, which is, one of the things that one does in communicating, if you can, is to reframe the situation. So if he can frame this as the US versus China, with China being the bad guys, which plays to his agenda, he'll do so. That's why he wanted to call it a Chinese virus.
So there you have it. Huge thanks again to David Tarsh for his insights this week. And if you haven't already done so, do have a listen to our Great Rail Journeys podcast with the fascinating Andy Brabin, the man who's travelled all over the world by train. That's all for this week. Enjoy your weekend, stay safe, stay healthy, stay home, and don't forget that our content will always be free for everyone, as we believe that travel is better without the crowds.